It is terrific to host my dear friend Chris Brose today, kind of
Thank
at
you.
SAIS, at the virtual SAIS,
Virtual
uh,
SAIS.
at virtual SAIS. Really excited to have you. Chris is extremely well known, of course, in the defense community. For folks who are not familiar with him, he's kind of this all-around interesting, provocative thinker, superstar type. And he's just come out with this terrific new book, The Kill Chain, which we are going to discuss today. And so the plan is, after a brief intro, I will ask Chris some questions, and then I will turn to audience questions. So the 100+ participants out there watching this, while I hate that we can't actually see you, please submit all of your really thoughtful questions into the Q&A box, and I will monitor that and throw some of your good ideas over to Chris. So let me introduce Chris. Chris is currently the Chief Strategy Officer for Anduril Industries, and he's also a Senior Fellow down the street from the SAIS Rome building at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has a really neat background because he's lived both in the executive branch and in the legislative branch. So on the executive side, he worked for Secretaries of State Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice in policy planning and on speech writing. And then he spent a long time on the Hill working for Senator McCain and kind of culminating in this extraordinary experience as the staff director of the Senate Armed Services Committee, which really means he was often pretty annoying to folks working in the Pentagon. But I think there was a lot of good fruit from the work he did. And I personally feel really grateful that folks in the Pentagon, myself included, had to deal with his incessant questions and ideas because he pushed us all to do better. I should just note, since I'm assuming we have a lot of SAIS students out there, Chris is, of course, an esteemed graduate of SAIS, of the Strategic Studies program, and I think he made a deliberate effort to surround himself and hire a whole bunch of our graduates while he worked on the Hill. It was always fun to go over there and just see former students, et cetera, wandering around. So let's talk a little bit about this great book, Chris. First of all, why did you write it? What inspired you to write this thing?
I asked myself that question every day while I was trudging through the writing of it. Why on earth did I agree to do this? It was a couple things. I mean, it was largely the product of my experience, working on the Hill, working on defense issues for a very long time, thinking them through, but not really having a place where I could, really sit down and sort of put thoughts down on paper, kind of work out in my own mind what I thought. So I think it was kind of twofold. One was a desire to what I thought was kind of, for a general audience, kind of create more of a sense of urgency in their minds of the problem as I saw it and understand it. And really that was kind of the story of, the more I saw, the more I worked on defense issues, the more concerned I became that we were falling behind, that we were not in the position that we needed to be in, and that there were real national security risks and consequences as a result of that. And, I wanted to tell that story to, to a broader audience than sort of the inside the Beltway kind of more niche defense audience. And then secondly, I really wanted to really try to think through, well, how do we change? How do we do things differently? It's easy to throw stones. It's harder to sit down and say, well, what should change and be different? And it took a lot of forms. I mean, it was partly thinking through kind of the implications of the technology. It was partly thinking through from a political, bureaucratic kind of economic perspective. How do you align the incentives to get different outcomes? But it was basically to the question of, there's a lot of discussion about, needing to do things differently. There's a lot of discussion about the ways in which technology will impact defense and the U.S. military. But for me, it still felt, kind of nebulous. It still felt a little too much like, well, if I have some AI and I sprinkle it on the things that I've got now, I'll have better things. And look, I'm not an AI expert or a data scientist. I more wanted to try to think through, again, at a level that general readers could engage with. How should we be thinking about these game-changing technologies and the impact that they're going to have on our military and our national defense?
That's terrific. And you have a really smooth writing style, which I think makes it particularly appealing, not just to these sort of national security wonks, who I'm guessing kind of comprise a lot of the folks who are listening right now, but also to folks who are maybe adjacent to that world. So how did we get to this point? I mean, you make some pretty stark and dramatic arguments that we've got some serious trouble in sort of the security environment for the U.S. military right now. It's stark, and I think particularly for folks who haven't been watching this sort of obsessively over the last few years or so, you're gonna give them a real gut punch. How did this even happen?
It's a great question, and there's I think a lot of threads to pull on it, and I would be curious, of any of the threads that you disagree with, would love to talk about it. I think there's a number of different pieces. I mean, one obvious kind of part is, we've been focused on, sort of a different set of priorities for much of the past 2 decades. That you had the events of 9/11, you had the reaction response to that. Some might say overreaction, over response. But it's no dismissing that really did lead us to focus on a subset of military problems and sort of very urgent current needs that we genuinely had to be attentive to. I think the bigger aspect of it is that we were disrupted. That I think this is a really hard problem, right? I mean, we're ultimately talking about how do you make big, complex, costly bets on the future. And that's a really hard thing to try to do. It's a hard thing, particularly for the military and sort of the defense establishment to do, because as a point I kind of make in the book, they're unlike any other industry in America because they don't get real world feedback, right? I mean, in the commercial world, you can take your products to market, and if people don't buy them, then you have pretty clear feedback that you've got the wrong products. I think what's especially tricky in defense is that, look, the better off you are at building a military, the less likely you are to have to use it. And that's a good thing. The challenge is that it also makes it very difficult to figure out sort of the self-assessment of, are we going in the right direction? Are we building the right capabilities? And, I think, I spend a lot of time focused on China in the book, largely because I think that they haven't tried to play the same game that we have. They very consciously and deliberately, over a very long period of time, played a different game, which was an inherently disruptive game focused on, building military capabilities that call into question all of the assumptions on which we've built our own military. And that's been a process that's played out right in front of us. It wasn't like a 9/11, where one morning it happened. I mean, it was just deliberate, piece by piece, kind of building momentum. Yeah, the sort of frog in the pot. And I think part of the problem was just that we have a system that's very geared toward addressing the needs of the present without necessarily being attentive to the needs of the future. The present always needs something now. The future can always wait. And I think that, compounded by the kind of the current operations and everything that we were doing, just ultimately got us into a position where, inertia and the sense that we have dominance and that we have overmatched militarily, that we are militarily superior to all of our competitors. I think that we were just too slow to recognize the extent to which we were being disrupted by a competitor, but also the ways in which emerging technologies that were completely transforming the commercial world for the past 10, 15, 20 years, but were largely absent from the defense world, we're ultimately also, significantly disrupting the way, the U.S. has built its military and operated it for a very long time.
Absolutely, but look, didn't some of that make sense? I mean, we were in the throes of these massive conflicts, right? There's all sorts of stories of folks trying to say, hey, let's worry about the future, let's worry about the Chinese, but you have, American servicemen and women dying in real places at real time.
Yeah. And that's true enough. And that is like a point I go out of my way to make clear in the book, that, that had to be the priority, and that deserved the attention that it received. I think, the problem is there's a bit of a myth, I think, in Washington, that the reason we aren't where we should be is because all of the money over the past 2 decades has gone to servicing the needs of the wars we've been fighting, current operations, et cetera. When you actually kind of look at how we've been spending most of our military budget, I mean, most of it has been going toward very large capital intensive military programs that, didn't really have much to do with defeating Al-Qaeda. And you look at all these modernization programs that began, kind of slightly before 9/11, slightly after 9/11. We were spending eye-watering amounts of money, even in the midst of, fighting these wars and the sort of post 9/11 period, trying to modernize our military. And I think, trying to do it, in my opinion, in many of the wrong ways. So the idea that, that we didn't have any money to modernize, I think, is just belied by the reality that we were spending inordinate amounts of money on, new aircraft carriers, new refueling tankers, new fighter jets, new surface combatants, many programs that, ate a lot of money and never saw the light of day. These were things that we were doing, to try to change. But I think we were trying to do it in the wrong ways.
So
we were doing it in the midst of current conflict.
No doubt. I mean, I think what you're really saying here, it's how we were spending that money. And obviously there's unfortunately a ton of examples where there were, needs, kind of clear needs for the wars, right? The tales of MRAPs, for example, that actually weren't getting funded. But there is this myth, I think, as you point out, when you kind of look across how many hundreds of billions of dollars were actually no kidding spent. So before we get into sort of solutions, which I want to spend some time on, because I think it's kudos to your book that you offer some, I do want you to make the argument to the folks who just don't necessarily find this compelling. So, you're effectively saying, hey, we need to worry a lot about losing this primacy. This is a problem. And you made the point that you're trying to write for a more general audience. But there are folks, particularly on the far left and on the far right, and, frankly, in places where I come from, like the Midwest, et cetera, we're just saying there's a lot of money there. And especially now in a time of COVID, et cetera, why in the world should we care about these things? You're telling us this is pretty problematic. Convince us.
Yeah. So it's a great question. And it's something that I struggle with in the book, right? Of the question of, well, why should I care?
Absolutely.
And I guess ultimately my answer to that is, I don't actually make the argument that sustaining primacy is something that we should be seeking, because I think that it's increasingly impractical. And I think that's just the position that we find ourselves in now from a military standpoint. This isn't the 1990s, where America is sort of, astride the world, dominant and lapping the competition. That's not where we are. And we've sort of passed out of this aberrational period of history, kind of at the end of the Cold War, where we were kind of in this unipolar moment. I think the challenge is, if sort of history is reverting back to more of the norm here, with sort of great power competition and rivalry, it's more to say that many of the things that we take for granted, as far as what military primacy has given us, what sort of military power and predominance have given us, those are the things that we are at risk of losing. That I go out of my way again in the book to try to make it clear to people that I don't believe that there's a hard power answer to every problem. If anything, I actually believe, and I spent the time in the State Department, I've lived this and worked this up close, that actually it's the other tools of American influence and power that are ultimately more influential, more important. But if you're not wielding them on a foundation of hard power and deterrence and the ability to prevent aggression and coercion and war, that is a problematic place to be. And that is the world that I worry about us moving into, kind of slowly and unknowingly, is a world where we can't actually deter aggression and coercion, and the things that we used to take for granted as being able to have influence, access, the ability to have markets where our companies weren't treated unfairly. The ability to get the things that we want, from the standpoint of trade and the movement of energy through international waters or airspace, that these are all things, all of the things that we count on, space to be able to provide us, access to information and other things, that if you're living in a world where you don't have the ability to deter bad behavior on the part of adversaries who might be keen on practicing it, you very quickly can start to lose things that you never thought you could lose. And that's the worry for me, is, when I look at history, it's a pretty dark place. And, we've been living for the past 25 or 30 years, I think, in, again, like a very aberrational moment where we could basically get what we wanted, have what we wanted, do what we wanted. And the main limitation on our ability to do those things was us. Our wisdom, our will, our power. And that's not the world we're moving into. And I think we need to be much more mindful that in a world of powers that have predatory behaviors or bad instincts toward us, or even just are going to act in their interest, even and especially when it's contrary to ours, economically, diplomatically, et cetera. The ultimate arbiter is the ability to check aggression and deter those kinds of bad behaviors, and never have a day where an adversary wakes up and thinks, I can get my way through violence. So maybe that'll just take that path because it's easier. These are the things that I don't want to have to think about. And I think the way in which we don't have to think about them as much is by having the power to deter them and prevent them. And I think we've had that power for so long that we've actually forgotten that these are things that we actually have to sort of check and balance and fight for.
I mean, I think some of what you're saying really, which resonates a lot, is it's a baseline, right? Yes, we've been in this sort of anomalous period of time. That doesn't mean it's been a butterflies and unicorns anomalous period of time. All sorts of bad things have happened, some of which we've enabled, some of which we've sort of just kind of let exist. But what I think, you're really trying to say here, a point that I kind of vehemently agree with, it can be so much worse, right? It's sort of the character of what this can look like.
Yep.
There is the simmer of, say, countering violent extremists that's going to continue to simmer and maybe sort of spike occasionally. But what you're really saying is, hey, this could be a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, the ability to keep these kinds of competitions peaceful, and I'm all for competition, economic competition and competition for influence, for friends, et cetera. But we want to ensure that those competitions, don't turn violent, that they don't turn into, conflict and war. And it's the ability to again, sort of create the sense in the mind of your adversary that they don't have anything to win or gain by resorting to those tools, whether it's, outright conflict, which I think is unlikely, but not impossible. But also then the sort of, so-called gray zone sort of level below the level of outright conflict where, you're still engaged in military competition, even if it's not as overt as, an outright war. Again, it's having that capability to ensure that these competitions play out stably, peacefully, and don't go off the rails. Those to me are muscle movements that we have to relearn. And ultimately, I think, in order to have that type of future, we have to recognize the extent to which our entire model of sort of military power has been disrupted, both by technology, increasingly by technology, but also by peer competitors.
No doubt. So you're effectively saying, hey, we need to rethink what we're doing, and here's why. I found your sort of solutions and your approach to them to be shockingly optimistic. I mean, maybe, it's because we sort of spent so much time over the years, like discussing the problems and kind of throwing various kind of attempts to try to solve them. And I want to sort of read a quick piece that hit me hard. You're talking about our system and how problematic it is. The great Charlie Stevenson is already asking the question, Q&A section, who in Congress and the executive branch are most likely to oppose your ideas? How deal with them? So you have this point where you're saying on page 227, the system makes it exceedingly difficult for America's military to change or change quickly. But as I've said from the start, I would not be writing this book if I thought all hope was lost. Well, that really is fantastic. Walk us through that, because a lot of these elements have been tried before. You're talking about choosing sort of bureaucratic and resource losers and winners. Give us some recipes.
Yeah, and I'm smiling because you think it's optimistic. I wrote the book thinking I was like completely doom and gloom, and everyone was basically going to say, I just need to get in a little wooden boat and row away from the mainland. I mean, I guess I try to make it, I try to find a way to say, look, like there is an avenue to change, right? I mean, the optimistic put on it is, the structural things that we need to make this change that I'm talking about are things that we have. We have awesome technology. We have an incredibly entrepreneurial people. We have like great people in government who are genuinely hardworking and mission focused. And we've got a ton of money. I mean, you know, as I write in the journal for the weekend, like defense budgets are going to turn down. I don't think that that's the end of the story for us. I think that we have the ability, if we think differently, to use even declining defense budgets more intelligently than we have to date. So the big piece is that, like, if we lacked any one of those, we would be like truly out of luck. We actually have. The biggest challenge, in my opinion, is us. So, you know, you can kind of look at it one of two ways. I tend to try to look at it on the brighter side to say, well, if the problem is us, I can change us. You know, like I can't create more money effectively. Like I can't like accelerate, you know, to an unrealistic degree, technology that I don't have. Mm-hmm. But if the problem is political will, if the problem is a set of incentives that are measuring the wrong things and buying the wrong outcomes, we can begin to change that. Now, like the way I would try to describe that is like, what I'm describing is very difficult, right? It's like, you know, I'm going to do a quadruple flip off of a 10-meter platform. It's possible, but it's going to be really hard and it might end badly. So again, like I don't want anyone to come away thinking that all hope is lost and we should basically just kind of fold up our tent. But it is going to be incredibly difficult. And I think, you know, what I try to get into in you know, kind of conclusions or, you know, how do we change is not getting into the eaches of, you know, well, we just need to buy more of this and less of that. I mean, it's more about, we actually need to change the way in which our system operates and the incentives that define it. And that is a statement about the Congress. It's a statement about the DoD. It's a statement about industry and technology and investment in America. So again, this is really big and hard, which is why I was thinking the entire time that, man, like this is going to be a real downer of a book. But at the same time, like, is it feasible? Yeah. And ultimately, to me, the biggest thing that does need to change, which I think is really what we were lacking for a long time, and we may be seeing change in that, I don't know, is we have to be able to imagine that the costs of not changing are worse than the costs of changing. For the longest time, I think we talked about change. It's not as if these ideas are new. I mean, there's so much about what I write in the book that people have been saying for 10, 20, 30 years. Absolutely. Like the more interesting question is, why do we keep saying the same things but not doing enough of it? Right. And you know, I think that really gets into this question of, because we've always looked at change as kind of a nice option. You know, it'd be good to change. It'd be a good opportunity. You know, we'd have a more efficient, effective military.
Yeah, there was a lot of other stuff going on.
There was a lot of other stuff, but it was more a sense of like change as an opportunity as opposed to change as a necessity. And you know, those are different things. And I think my hope now, and certainly what I'm trying to convey in the book, is change is a necessity. Like if we don't change, if we keep going the direction we're going, kind of planning with the same goals, the same ways, the same means, we're going to end up in a truly bad place. And we're a lot closer to that place, in my opinion, than I think most Americans realize. So, you know, it's possible, but it's really difficult.
No doubt. I mean, the idea of changing incentives is one that I think resonates. I'd like to push a little harder on how one does that. And in particular, sure. I'm curious to hear, what does civilian control and civilian oversight kind of fit into this idea of changing incentives?
Yeah. So I think civilian control is absolutely essential. And in terms of changing, like, you're not going to get there without it, right? I mean, if you have a situation where you have weak civilian leadership or no civilian leadership, as you know, I think, you know, we've often had over the past few years in the Department of Defense, you're not going to get this kind of bold change, because you need civilian leaders who have been, you know, either elected to office in the case of Congress or confirmed by the Senate to hold these positions in the Department of Defense. You know, those are the people who have the authority vested in them by the public and the Constitution to make these big consequential moves And they're the ones who are ultimately going to need to be accountable for it, right? The bureaucracy can't do this on its own, even if people in the bureaucracy understand, arguably as much as more than their senior leaders, what really does need to change, what really is wrong. The uniformed military can't do this either, because you're ultimately getting into areas that are just fundamentally in the domain, of political leadership, civilian leadership. So, to me, it is the sine qua non of how you can make this process of change. But it's not the only thing. I mean, you do have to have other incentives aligned in order to get there. And you have to be, civilian leaders have to make very clear to their military subordinates, to the rest of the system, what problems they are trying to solve. They need to create incentives for people to actually take risk and be rewarded for doing so. Mm-hmm. But with respect to civilian leadership, I mean, I try to emphasize in the book that when I say civilian leadership, I just don't mean the Secretary of Defense. Mm-hmm. This absolutely has to be, kind of a partnership of equals between the civilian leadership and the Department of Defense, or, the administration in power, and the Congress. And, the great benefit of the Congress is there's longevity there. Many of these people stay in their positions for a very long period of time. The problem, as I saw in my time in the Senate, was, all too often, the department, just basically treats the Congress like children. They don't tell them anything. They want them to sit in the corner and color. And then when the adults have made a decision, they'll sort of come in after the fact and explain what's happening. And it's just, it doesn't work. It builds resentment. It breeds, kind of bad reactions. Ultimately, there needs to be an alignment between the civilian leadership of the United States, both executive and legislative, to know what we're trying to do and sort of move in lockstep to do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely. I mean, within that, one of the challenges I've always found in our field is that people will go to the executive or they'll go to the legislative, and kind of never the twain shall meet, right? You don't have opportunities to engage, outside of a SAIS classroom, which would be a fantastic place, of course, to sort of start to form these relationships. But unless you can find other ways to kind of get comfortable with one another, one becomes very nervous that I found this from the Pentagon, right? That anything you say to Congress, you're sort of just going to misspeak, cause problems, etc. And it can be really difficult to sort of acknowledge, actually, these can be important allies. And oh, by the way, you're supposed to engage them anyway. There's just, all of those barriers.
Right. Yeah, I think that's completely right. I mean, my sense was always that, so many people in the Department of Defense were not set up for success when they came to engage with the Congress. Basically people would put the fear of God into them, tell them that if they said one wrong word, their careers and lives were over. And it just doesn't create, that kind of open dialogue. I mean, so often the things that I kind of longed for and occasionally found from the DoD were people who are willing to say, look, we are in a common problem together, and we don't know exactly where we're going. We don't have a clear sense of what the right answers are. And we want to bring you into the process and work on it together. Just that alone, kind of begins to build goodwill in the Congress, and begins to, I think, create space for the Department of Defense and the people in the DoD to, to operate differently, to recognize that they're not going to get everything perfect. Occasionally programs are going to fail, but like, let's fail the right ways. Let's do it knowing that we're taking risks, and, that we're going to bear those risks together. These are the kinds of things and conversations that I just didn't see happen nearly enough while I was on the Hill.
Absolutely. I think it's true, right? You're sort of trying to find a way for them to collaborate and trust one another, which is invariably going to be a bit terrifying, but the times where it's worked well, it seems there's been a lot of goodness there.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, the only way to trust people is by trusting people. I mean, you have to build that over time. And I think fundamentally that's what we're talking about here, is the ability to build relationships between people and to trust them, so that there's a clear sense of ownership and authority and accountability, and a recognition that we're all in this together, rather than, each side sort of playing gotcha with one another.
No doubt. So there are some really good questions in our Q&A that I want to kind of combine. We've got one of our newest graduates, Michael Cooper, who's saying, is there this danger that we're going to rely too much on technology? How do we sort of think of that? And as you're kind of pondering that answer, I'd really welcome your thoughts on some fantastically provocative questions by Jim Perkins and Jeff Payne, who are effectively saying, hey, do we have the right folks to do this? Do we have the right kind of senior uniformed leadership? Do we have the right, let's say, civilian leadership as well? If I can expand his problem, like, do we have the right folks to actually make the sorts of changes that are needed?
Yeah. There's always a danger of relying too much on technology. And again, go out of my way in the book to say, like, nobody should take away the belief that I think that technology is some kind of deus ex machina that's going to solve all of our problems. It isn't. I think the bigger problem is not knowing what we want technology to do. And, it's the problem of, what are the operational problems that we're trying to solve? Because if we're not focused on what those problems are, if we're not thinking about the actual outcomes we're trying to achieve, then we don't know how to actually think about the employment of technology, for military purposes. It tends to, again, be this sort of retroactive idea of, well, I'll just take these new technologies and I'll put them into the things I've always had, and I'll use them in the ways that I've always operated, and it'll just be marginally better, which at times may be the right answer, but I don't think the right way to think about the problem. Personally, I think that we are way too leaning on the side of, not reliant enough on technologies that are readily available now. I mean, I'm not suggesting here that, the types of ideas that I'm proposing, like, requires the invention of new physics. What actually kind of breaks my heart is just the extent to which I have, friends in the military who use technology every day in their commercial lives that when they put their uniforms on and go to work, they don't have access to. That to me is heartbreaking and infuriating. Like, this isn't witchcraft. I mean, this is stuff that we are using right now, that we are using in our everyday lives, oftentimes. To the question of, do we have the right people? That's a harder one. I think and it's going to be case by case. Do we have the right people? Like, yes, they're there. Are we identifying them, kind of putting them into the right positions of leadership, promoting them? Again, that's case by case. I mean, I think the broad comment I'd make about it is that, on average, I want to see the Department of Defense be more knowledgeable about these technologies. Because if you don't have, like, you don't need to be software developers and data scientists, but there needs to be a baseline level of understanding of what's even possible. And that to me is, again, a source of frustration, like in my current life, is having to convince people that things that they want to do are actually things that are currently available to them to do.
So it's the failure of imagination problem.
It's a failure of imagination, but it's also it's a failure of knowledge. I mean, I think, it gets again to the question of incentives. I mean, if we say that these technologies are going to be central to future military advantage, if they're going to be integral to the military, the American military of the future, then the people who are tasked with building that military and taking us into the future and operating it are going to have a knowledge, at least a working knowledge, like smart enough to be dangerous knowledge, of how to be intelligent consumers of this technology, and to be able to think creatively about how it enables them to operate differently, and build different kinds of military capabilities. So to me, like, that's what I would be looking for in answering the question, do we have the right people to make this change? There's the broader question of, people with the sense of urgency who genuinely believe that we need to change. I actually see a lot of that. I think it's more to the question of there's urgency, but then you ask, well, so what are we going to do? That's when things start to break down a bit.
No, I mean, it does seem as though the conversation has shifted a lot over the last 2 years or so. I mean, the sort of need to make the argument is less and less, at least within the national security bubble. I think on solutions is in particular where you're finding so much kind of debate and fighting.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that, as I kind of say in the book, I mean, a lot of that change has played out in the past couple of years. But again, I mean, the comment I'd make in the same breath is, what's striking about, as I went back to write this book, and went back to look at, many of the things that we were writing and saying, through the 1990s and the early 2000s, it's just so strikingly similar to the things that we're saying now. It's not as if, to a certain extent, we are saying new things. We are kind of talking about new technologies that just didn't exist at the time. But in terms of the problems we're focused on, the things that we want to do, there are so many things we're now saying that were the same as the things that we did say. And I think that's, where I kind of root the question of, well, how do we change, really needs to come back to, there are systemic impediments and misalignments of incentives that have prevented the United States from doing many of the things that we actually said were important, and that we needed to do, but we didn't do nonetheless. That, I think, is the question of where we should focus on, how do we do things differently? We can say things, and that's great, but if we actually haven't fundamentally addressed kind of the root causes of the problems and the incentive structure in our establishment, we shouldn't expect to get fundamentally different outcomes, especially if we're moving, as I believe we are, into a new era of kind of defense austerity. Like, we just ran the social science experiment. And the present won and the future lost, right? The last decade, post-sequestration, or post-financial crisis sequestration, are we equipped now to make more strategic choices than we did over the last decade? Are we going to manage that downturn differently than we did in the past, where, the future constantly ended up without a seat when the music stopped?
Right. It'll be so curious to see. As utterly problematic as sequestration was, one could have seen that as an opportunity of sorts. And obviously, I see that as someone who's, trying and not terribly successful in doing so in the Pentagon.
Ditto. That's right, ditto.
You're getting a lot of questions on culture, so I thought we should push that for a sec. One of our current students, Sam Blumenthal, is saying, what do we do about these culture differences with Silicon Valley? One of our newest grads, Dennis Murphy, is talking about this idea of, do you need to just look outside your traditional actors as you're trying to, kind of push these sorts of changes? How might you answer those?
Yeah, it's a great question. Personally, I think the question of culture tends to be a boogeyman. We tend to set it up as this great sort of amorphous, kind of inchoate problem that always stands in our way. And
they were hoodies.
Well, I'm not suggesting that it isn't a challenge, but I guess I'm more saying that, my belief is that, culture is produced by groups of people and institutions, patterns of behavior over a very long period of time, which then you kind of peel the onion back. It's to the incentives that lead those people to make those choices and engage in those behaviors. Culture is changeable. Culture isn't kind of a concrete impediment in front of our way. And it's going to take time to change. But it again comes back to the question of creating different incentives. So you take the question of Silicon Valley. The culture, so-called, that we sort of see there, I think, is again born out of a long period of time where the Department of Defense wasn't really buying what Silicon Valley was selling. They weren't transitioning emerging technologies and commercial technologies into large-scale military programs. SAIS has done great work on looking at all of the companies that sought to do business with the federal government, kind of over the past 2 decades, and you just have 80% of them gone after a decade. You have 17,000 companies leaving the defense business from 2011 to 2015 alone. Like, that doesn't create an incentive for new founders to want to do defense work. It doesn't create an incentive for the best and brightest engineers in America to say, I want to go work on a program, that I like, I don't want to go design aircraft because I might only get the option of, the opportunity to design 2 of them in the course of my career. And then all the investment is going to follow that. And it followed it into, where they could get returns and where people could turn small companies and startups into billion-dollar businesses. And that was advertising optimization and, things that, I would consider to be, less important than national security. But again, like, there are reasons that happened. This didn't just occur. And that culture is something that's built over a very long period of time, but it's changeable. And it's something that, I think we need to think about why we've ended up in the place that we have, and how we go about changing the incentives to get a different outcome.
This is the optimism coming out again. I like it.
Again, like it's like quadruple flip off of a 10-meter platform, but it is
can
doable.
be done. Excuse me. No doubt, but can be done. And just as you're talking about sort of different actors or so, I want to pull this thread that's one of our super smart PhD students, Jeb Bankowski, has thrown out, which is, to what extent do we kind of think about this on our own, if you will? So alliances, partnerships, are you seeing any changes there that would be particularly helpful or unhelpful to kind of making the changes that you're pitching?
I don't spend as much time in the book looking at the looking at the actions of our allies. I do, go out of my way to underscore that, especially in a world where American military primacy is ending, allies are inherently far more important to us than they ever have been.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly capable allies who are going to be able to sort of work with us, interoperate with us, kind of pull their weight. Those countries are more important to us than ever. And I think we're going to be more dependent on them than we ever have been. That if what we're trying to do is, blunt Chinese aggression in Asia, well, the ability to operate on the territory of our allies is going to be really important. So we're going to have to manage those political and diplomatic sensitivities far more so than we even thought we had to. In terms of what those allies are doing, like I think there's a lot of good things that we can point to. Again, when I kind of keep the focus on, what are we as the United States doing to sort of enable that or create incentives for that. I would like to see us much more focused on, how those core allies to the United States and Asia and Europe can really be contributors to, kind of a joint effort, a multilateral effort, where there is more division of labor, where there is sort of common investment strategies, where, we are seeking to figure out, how we can take advantage of capabilities that we each have to be complementary. And getting away, I think, from the idea that, what matters is how much our allies are spending on defense.
Mm-hmm.
It's an important metric. It's not to dismiss it, but I'm much more interested in what I'm getting as the United States in terms of allied contributions and capability than I am how much they're spending. Like, I'm not interested in Greece's 2%, because their economy collapsed. I'm interested very much, in Norway's 1.7. How can we incentivize smart spending and spending that is aligned with, with our priorities, the capabilities we're trying to build, and really take advantage of countries that are doing awesome work technologically.
Mm-hmm.
In some respects, as good, if not better than us, and really leverage that as a way of bringing it into the U.S. military.
That makes sense. And how dramatic would you be in those pushes? Do you think we should be a lot more blunt with these allies and partners about the things they need to do? And looking domestically, do we need, say, the Congress to be a lot more blunt about its ideas as well? Do you want some sort of legislation to come down out of this? Do you want a new Goldwater Nichols? Play out, as you're talking about changing incentive structures, play out that manifestation in a really tangible way.
Yeah. So with respect to allies, I do think that, we're getting to a place where the question has to be asked that if you expect the United States to defend you, then you have an obligation to make yourself more defensible. You can't continue to have misaligned priorities and buy the wrong things with the expectation that America will ride to your rescue and fight to the last American for your sake. I'm saying it undiplomatically, but that's what I have the benefit of doing these days. But the point is that needs to be a very clear conversation, because we're not living in a world anymore where I think we can kind of afford to have a lot of extracurricular activities. Like, we are going to need to sort of audit our international commitments and look at them through the lens of what are truly important to us, and what are doable, and where we are finding commitments that are looking a little rickety. The question needs to be, are there things that we need to do to change, or are there things that our allies need to do to change? I think that needs to be a very clear conversation with our allies, and as a way of goading them to do, and kind of creating incentives for them to do more, which is, look, we can fall back if we have to. Don't want to, but we can. In terms of incentives here, you know, a lot of it to me comes down to the money. You know, what people say is interesting. What people spend money on in the defense establishment is where you can discern what they actually care about and value. So it's interesting that people are saying a lot about AI, but when we're still spending like a fraction of our defense budget on it, that tells you something. So I think from the standpoint of the Congress, from the standpoint of the Department of Defense, it really is about creating change will happen when you're actually seeing them moving money into the technologies that they say are important, and doing them in ways that are turning into actual military programs, not science experiments that are fun to do and interesting for a year or two, but then they never go anywhere. They just disappear into the proverbial valley of death. I think the money moving in the direction of the things we say are important is what will create incentives for industry and investors to put their own resources towards solving these problems differently. Again, there's a reason why, you know, small fortunes of private investment have gone not to defense, but to, you know, financial technology and biotechnology, commercial technology. If the department were actually buying more of the things that they say are important, investors are going to help fund companies to build them. Companies are going to put their own investment toward building capabilities that they think the Department of Defense and the Congress are actually going to buy at scale and on-ramp quickly. Like I actually believe like we tend to overthink this problem a lot. You know, that when we get into questions of you know, culture and other things, you know, there's a lot about this that really does have to do with, you know, we actually need to do the things that we say we value and are, you know, believe are important. And what that actually looks like a lot of times is spending the money on the things that we say we value. And in so doing, you begin to create incentives to industry, to investors, you know, inside of the department that, you know, this is where we are going. And, you know, if you want to get out ahead of that, you know, like you need to move urgently, and you'll be rewarded if you do so.
And to what extent, though, are you not, I don't know, I guess dismayed by how hard our processes make that? You know, you've got so many different folks for a whole bunch of reasons that are entirely valid who have their fingers in the pot. And I mean, even for folks who sort of obsessively follow what's happening in the defense budget, it can be really difficult to say, oh yes, you know, you've told me your emphasis is on this, and you've actually put your money toward those things.
Yeah, I think that is the greatest source of frustration, and I lived this dream every day when I was in the Congress. You know, it's again, I mean, it's not because the people are bad. It's not because they're not hardworking or they're not mission focused. I mean, we have outstanding people in our government. You know, what just brings me to tears is how they have to work in a system that too often is completely backwards in terms of the incentives, you know, where we're not actually focused on buying outcomes. We're focused on buying process and inputs and managing things on the basis of, you know, are you moving all of your money this month based on the targets that you had preset for you? You know, if the emphasis is on that and sort of managing the process and cost accounting and you know, kind of setting out what we believe our requirements are, and then sort of building the spec, you know, we're not going to get different outcomes. And you know, we have to think about, you know, how we can structure incentives around actually buying the things that we say are important. And I don't mean inputs, I mean objectives, right? It's why I called the book The Kill Chain, is that like the objective of a military is not to accumulate more of the things that we have always had. And it's not to necessarily, you know, it's to actually do things differently. It is to be able to understand what's going on and make decisions better and faster, to create effects without getting into the ways in which I'm doing that. That's, I think, where you can really start to turn people's entrepreneurial energy into solving these problems differently. And, you know, we've done that before. You know, like in recent history, we have done that before. So again, like, I'm not saying it isn't going to be hard, but I don't want anybody to walk away thinking it's hopeless.
No doubt, no doubt. Appreciating the optimism again, and it's right. Our process is what our process is. It doesn't mean one goes for authoritarianism instead. Um, so let us continue on this optimistic note. That's depending, I guess, on how you answer this next question. But I'm seeing a lot of questions, and given obviously that this is being sponsored by a university, we have to talk about grading. So give us some grades. Look across the services. There's a specific question about the Marines, of course, being led by the extraordinary General Dave Berger, SAIS Strategic Studies alum.
Indeed.
Can you give us some grades? And ideally, these would be both positive and negative grades. Who's doing well and who's not doing well?
That's hard and unfair. Look, I mean, the actual answer is it's like everybody gets incompletes, right? I mean,
Everybody can't give incompletes. Come on.
I think it's different, right? I mean, I think the Marine Corps is doing an outstanding job in the sense that there's a senior leader who genuinely understands not just the kind of urgency of change, but actually to a very deep technical and operational level, the ways in which he believes his service has to change, and is actively trying to manage that process with all of the different stakeholders involved, and that's hard and complex. So I give the commandant very high marks in that regard. I think the Air Force is. They recognize the ways in which things like command and control, sort of accelerating decision, are going to be central, and I give them a lot of credit for moving out and saying, like, we will take that on. We will provide that for the Joint Force. Now, how we're going to get there, that's when things start to get complicated, and that's going to be a process that's going to play out. It's going to be very very tricky. The Army, I think, my concern with the Army is just that they have bucketed their modernization focus into, very traditional, kind of new versions of old things. Mm-hmm. But there are areas in which, there's very encouraging work happening, where they actually are thinking differently about how these kind of integrated and enabling capabilities can allow them to fight differently. I think much of the thinking that General Wesley's done is really good. It's just the question of, okay, well, now how do you build that? Like, how do you get that out of a laboratory or out of kind of an inception phase and begin iterating with it? The Navy, I give the Navy a lot of credit for wanting to move into unmanned systems, and I think to a large extent, they're trying to move faster than the Congress is letting them. We can get into the conversation about why that's happening, but I do give them a lot of credit. I do think there's a growing realization that we've been building a Navy that we can't afford for a very long time, chasing a goal that we're never going to get to, and that the answer isn't a 355 ship Navy. It's probably like a 3,000 ship Navy built of completely different kinds of systems than the ones that we've expected. But are they going to get there fast enough? Are they going to change enough? Will the Congress enable them to do that? Again, I think all these are kind of incompletes.
That makes a lot of sense. And obviously for the Navy, if you still don't consider unmanned platforms part of your ship count, it's 355 is problematic for many, many reasons, no doubt, as you know, but in particular, just the definition of it is its own challenge. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I know that that's not an easy thing to do, to try to offer these grades, and I think you're giving a pretty thoughtful answer. I'd like to push you a little bit more along those lines, though. You do a nice job, I think, in the book, kind of offering up areas for investment, and you talk about kind of the need to cut some legacy programs. Can you push that divestment piece a little bit? To the extent you could say, all right, we're going to stop funding these 3 or 4 things, or really reconsider investing in them. Can you kind of play that out a bit?
Yeah. So I tend to think about it in the sense of maybe kind of up a level at sort of the mission level, right? Okay. So, and this will come as no surprise to folks who've worked with me. I mean, going back many years, I've been asking the question of, whether amphibious forced entry is really going to be something that, we're going to contemplate doing particularly against, a near peer competitor when, the Navy is steaming 1,000 miles in the opposite direction. Which isn't to say that we shouldn't have some capability there, but should we be building our Marine Corps around that mission? I don't think the answer is yes. So I think that you have to begin looking at divestments in those areas that, you had been sort of emphasizing for that mission. Similarly, when you talk about, we have an inordinate amount of our Army tied up in light infantry and aviation. Is that a smart investment in light of what we are looking at that Army to do from the standpoint of, kind of heavier ground combat deterrence in Russia or in Europe, in the sense of, kind of a more fires intensive military or Army? I think those are the kinds of things we're going to have to start, cutting into, kind of aviation, light infantry. I think manpower across the board, right? I mean, all the services always want to grow. They always want more people, but the people are the most expensive part. And they're the cost that once you start paying, that cost is with you for the 20 years that person is likely in service. And those costs compound exponentially. I think across the board, we need to be thinking differently about, at a time where we're ultimately talking about technology's opportunities to begin automating more processes, more systems. We shouldn't be sort of significantly growing the size of our military. And if anything, we should start about thinking about, how we do more with fewer humans, because that really is the opportunity that these technologies present. I'd start there. I think, that's not a bad place to begin, but, I think eventually we're going to have to start tackling sacred cows as well. The carrier comes to mind. I think, it's just hard for me to imagine that we're going to have as many of them and be reliant on them as we are at the sort of dates in the future where we are still expecting to be operating them. These are things that I would tend to look at. Short range fighters. We are significantly invested in sort of tactical air at a time where our adversaries are investing in systems that are pushing the range that we're going to have to operate farther and farther back. We're probably going to need to start, divesting of those systems to invest in, lower cost, more attritable unmanned systems, or, longer range, kind of more standoff systems. Those are divestments that we should be looking hard at making.
So with 1 minute left, of course, you mentioned carriers, which means we clearly could use another few hours on this conversation. I do want to ask you one very, very brief question, though. You wrote this book and you say a lot of things in it, right? You are provocative, you offer ideas, and I'd like you to just spend a moment talking particularly to the students and the recent grads who are on this call, a little bit about that. Anyone who knows you or has worked with you knows you have a lot of ideas and you will throw spaghetti at the wall and want to sort of go over them and ponder them, right? And that's more than a little scary, because whenever you throw out ideas, some percentage of them will be wrong, right? And obviously you worked for Senator McCain, who was a dear mentor to you, who was also known for having this sort of energy and enthusiasm and appetite for kind of vision ideas. Can you give folks kind of a 30-second wrap up of sort of how do you do that, right?
So you do it by being wrong a lot more than you're right, which I am very confident that I am. I don't know. I mean, I think that it's my belief on these things is that, look, the people who are on this call, the people who are going to SAIS, these are reflective, critical thinking, intelligent people. They're wrestling with these problems and they're formulating ideas. I think it's ultimately about, having your say, that if you have something that you think, even if you don't believe that it's right, or that you don't believe that it's completely right, I think there's still merit in putting the idea forward. That if you've thought deeply about it, if you have confidence that you're thinking about the problem the right way, you think you have the right answer, because ultimately that's where these things are going to be sorted out, right? I mean, I think part of the reason I felt inclined toward, when I was on the Hill and currently in this book, toward wanting to put ideas out there, was actually under the belief that many of them would be wrong. but at least they would get people thinking more about it, or they would be, starting debates that I believed we needed to have that would sort of draw people out. One of the powers that I believe the Congress doesn't use enough, that I used regularly, was the power to sort of propose stuff. Because even if you're not proposing the right things, if you're pointing at things that aren't right, it makes it very difficult for the people who are sort of overseeing that to defend what they're doing if it's not as defensible as they might believe. So it's the beginning of getting to the right answer, which is going to have to be kind of iterative. It's going to have to be kind of collectively gotten to. And I think, sort of being a bit of a gadfly, or being a bit of a, kind of goad to getting those answers out there and moving. I've always personally believed there's value in it. I'm prepared to sort of, take the slings and arrows for being wrong, which I will be, and likely am all over the place in my book. But I think there's value in it, and it's certainly one of the things that I took away from my SAIS experience. Certainly the way the classrooms ran, and sort of the way I wanted to engage in that process. And I think there's a lot of value to it in the workforce and professional capacity, and certainly in sort of the national security arena right now.
Absolutely, that's fantastic. Look, you've done that well in your professional life, to be willing to ask and to start difficult and uncomfortable conversations, and you've obviously used various mantles to do that. Most recently, of course, in this book. So, congratulations on the book, Chris. For folks who haven't read it, I strongly recommend you do so. And many thanks for tuning in today. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Mara.
Bye.